The Bible is full of contradictions. Jennifer Bird speaks of some of them in her first chapter. To Bird's list, I add Genesis 19 does not make it clear how many daughters Lot has. At one point, there is talk about the daughters not having known a man, and there's talk about the daughters having husbands. Lot has sons-in-laws. Psalm 22 suggests God will forsake God's children, but Psalm 46 argues God is a very present help. The father of Zerubbabel is Pedaiah in 1 Chronicles 3, but is Shealtiel in Ezra 2. And the census count for the Israelites was 800,000 in 2 Samuel 24, but 1,100,000 in 1 Chronicles 21. Biblical scholars have invested enormous resources in order to understand these contradictions. One of the major, long-held explanations for biblical contradictions, at least in the Pentateuch, is the documentary hypothesis. The purpose of this lecture is to familiarize you with the documentary hypothesis and to examine the priestly cosmology. Today, I'm interested in making sure you have a sense of the history or background of the hypothesis and its basic elements. I'm also interested in helping you understand how the priestly writer, or P-source, understood the world. To that end, in this lecture, I also introduce you to the priestly cosmology. Source criticism is an interpretive method or exegetical method that seeks to answer the questions created by repetitions and inconsistencies in the biblical text. The use of two distinct names for God in Genesis, contradictory styles of writing that appeared side by side in a single book. For example, calling the covenant mountain Mount Sinai in one line and Mount Horeb in the next. Also, the act of repeating whole incidents a few chapters apart. For instance, the strange tale of how a patriarch lies in telling a foreign king that his wife is really his sister occurs in Genesis 12, Genesis 20, and Genesis 26. All this led 18th century German and English researchers to explore the written sources for the Pentateuch. Julius Wellhausen, in his book Prolegomena to the History of Ancient Israel, identified 4 clear written sources in the first 5 books of the Bible. His schema became known as the documentary hypothesis. As we talk about the documentary hypothesis, I want you to think about what you know about quilts and quilt making. I do not sew, but what I know about quilting is it requires the knitting together of pieces that were not originally part of the same piece or swath of cloth. In the quilting analogy, different patches are sewn together with different hands who would have made different stitch patterns. Similarly, in the biblical corpus, different stories of the Pentateuch are sewn together. We call the way we understand the different swaths and hands as the documentary hypothesis. An important characteristic of Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis is its attention to the potential history of how each source came to be. You may also find this hypothesis referred to as J, E, D, and P. With it, the biblical student not only can discover 4 different authors and their literary styles, but can picture the time and place from which each source comes. The first source is the Yahwist source. This source is abbreviated with a J and is also known as the J source. The Yahwist forms the heart of the Pentateuchal structure because all of the various traditions are built around the basic plot first found in J. This plot consists of 7 steps. 1. Stories of human origins. 2. The promise of the patriarchs. 3. The oppression in Egypt. 4. The exodus from Egypt. 5. The wandering in the wilderness. 6. The covenant at Mount Sinai. And 7. On the edge of the promised land. Each of the 4 sources, J, E, D, and P, include these 7 elements in some way. The Yahwist, or J source, refers to God as Yahweh and depicts God as having human qualities. God is anthropomorphic, walks and talks with humans. The Yahwist probably wrote from the southern kingdom in Judah and records Moses encountering God at Mount Sinai. Genesis 2, in which the Lord God plants a garden and takes a rib from man to create woman, is an example of a J source text. Exodus 1 through 24 and Numbers 11 through 12 are also J source text. Unlike the juxtaposing of 2 creation narratives in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the flood story is presented as a combination of J source and P source narratives in Genesis 6 through 9. Importantly, in the case of the flood story, it appears as though J is an enhancement of P source, which we'll cover shortly. J's account of the flood story differs from P's in significant ways, and we will examine some of these in the future. J distinguishes between clean animals, which may be slaughtered for food and sacrifice, and unclean animals, which may not. Hence, 7 pairs and 1 pair. J's account of the flood is structured in 40-day and 7-day periods. We'll see P uses 150-day periods, and the flood lasts for a year and 10 days. J's flood is the result of a prolonged rainstorm. P's flood will be a form of decreation, or an undoing or rolling back of creation. The second source is the Elohist, remaking of the basic Yahwist account. This source is abbreviated with an E and is also known as the E source. Generally, scholars believe the E source did not include as much material as does the J story, and what it does cover tends to favor the northern kingdom and its ideas. For example, E source pays much less attention to Abraham than to Jacob, a patriarch who lived in the area of Shechem, Bethel, and other northern cities. The Elohist refers to God as Elohim and depicts God as being transcendent. God is ethereal. God is remote. God is aloof. God speaks in dreams and by messengers, and often communicates through prophets. And here Moses would be considered a prophet. Examples of E-source texts include Genesis 22, the almost sacrifice of Isaac, the entire Exodus in Exodus 13, and the story of Balaam and the Moabites in Numbers 22-24. The E-source records Moses encountering God at Mount Horeb as opposed to Mount Sinai. The third source is the Deuteronomist. The D source material is found in the book of Deuteronomy and stresses obedience to Moses' admonitions. The D source refers to God as Yahweh, has a more moralistic tone than the other sources, and is concerned with matters of the northern kingdom. Finally, the fourth source is the priestly source. This source is also known as the P source. The P source material was the last source to be put together. It is dated latest. It was most likely penned at the end of the Babylonian exile or after the Israelites returned to Judah. To help people maintain their faith in the God of Israel, even when everything seemed to have been lost, P set out all the aspects of Israel's faith that were still valid. The P source includes in its story the reasons for keeping the Sabbath. We see this in Genesis 1. The origins of circumcision. We see this in Genesis 17. The divine command to obey all the cultic and religious laws. We see this in Leviticus 1 through 27, Numbers 1 through 10, Numbers 25 through 36. And the important role of the high priest next to Moses himself. And we see this in Exodus 4, 28, Numbers 1, and other portions of the Pentateuch. The priestly source generally refers to God as Elohim and depicts God as being concerned with cultic or religious issues. The P source tends to focus on genealogies and lists. P is concerned with the unconditional covenants of God, with Noah for humankind and with Abraham for Israel. P looks at the story of Israel's experience of God, the genealogies as threads joining key stories of Israel's becoming a people of God, the travel itineraries as threads joining key stories of Israel's journey from Egypt to Sinai and toward the Promised Land. P's account of the flood story differs from J's in several ways, and we've spoken about that a bit. P has no mention of any distinction between clean and unclean animals. P's picture of the flood is basically one of decreation. The waters that were put apart to create or pulled apart to create living space in Genesis 1 surged to blot out life in Genesis 6 through 9. P's flood lasts for a year and 10 days. This chart now demonstrates the differences between the four sources or authors based upon Wellhausen's work. It will be important for you to remember elements of this chart. It will help you in this class as well as in your personal engagements with the biblical text. The documentary hypothesis applies to the Torah, and importantly perhaps the one book with which most people are familiar, Genesis. Importantly, the P source, perhaps because it is the latest and benefits from having a historical view that the other sources simply did not, placed an indelible stamp on the first 5 books of our Bibles. Although the work of the P source ends with Deuteronomy, the priests themselves informed writings beyond the book of Deuteronomy. It is to the priestly cosmology that I now turn. One way to think about the priestly cosmology is as a way for the Israelites to understand themselves in relation to God. The cosmology, then, was a system of understanding relationships. A primary concern of the priestly cosmology was to maintain its ethnic identity. The priestly writers understood Israel's defeat to Babylon as the result of the loss of ritual purity before God. And according to the priestly cosmology, this purity must be maintained in order to retain God's favor. This identity and purity would give the priests control and keep them and the Israelites in the land God had promised. To be clear, the priests acted as mediators between the people and God. To facilitate this, they set up a system of laws, which they may have which may have some basis in practicality, but really function as a way to demonstrate differentiation of the Israelites from those around them, the others, and before God. As an example, some things are holy and others are not, and the holy and the unholy are not to be mixed. Dietary regulations were another way to maintain difference. Israelites, for example, differentiated themselves from others by not eating scavenger birds because those birds eat blood, and blood is forbidden to the Israelites because blood contains the life force and thus is of God. Leviticus 11:13 through 19 lists the eagle, vulture, buzzard, raven, ostrich, owls, hawks, and bats among the birds that the Israelites are not to eat. A similar list appears in Deuteronomy 14:12 through 18. Lobster is forbidden because it, like shellfish, is a creature that is both on land and in the sea, an inappropriate mixing. The priestly cosmology is laid out across portions of Exodus, portions of Leviticus, and the book of Numbers. In many ways, the priestly cosmology centers around three major questions. What is holy? How do we treat the holy? And how do we demonstrate holiness? Let's consider the major elements of the priestly cosmology. The tabernacle, slaughter and sacrifice, ritual or religious celebrations, the consecration of priests, impurity laws, improper sexual relations, and genealogy. You will remember the P source of the documentary hypothesis was a fan of lists and genealogies. For brevity, I will take up the elements of the tabernacle, slaughter and animal sacrifice, and impurity laws in this lecture. The tabernacle. The tabernacle was the central place for community worship. In P, the theological idea of imagining a central sanctuary, even while Israel was wandering in the wilderness, was paramount. Slaughter and sacrifice. The practice of sacrifice served as a way to make atonement for the mixing of or transgression and functioned as a way to repair the tear in the cosmic order that such events caused. This was most often done by the spilling of blood of an animal as a kind of ritual detergent that would restore order. In this way, the priests were able to keep the cosmic system in balance and help people as they transitioned from unclean back to clean. These laws kept the priesthood in charge and gave proper order to the world around them by maintaining a particular ethnic identity. This identity was essential to keep giving to the temple and keep the priestly class in power. The priestly cosmology also attends to matters of atonement. Simply put, atonement is the reconciliation between estranged parties, bringing them into agreement. The focus of the universal problem of sin, which humankind is unable to solve, and which disrupted the perfect harmony between God and creation, causing separation and death. Atonement, therefore, is God's way of bridging the gap and giving life. Atonement is described as sacrifice, substitution, mediation, and judgment. The repentant sinner slaughtered the sin offering. On the Day of Atonement, a goat was slain. Hence, atonement necessitated the death of a victim. Impurity laws. Purity and impurity takes many forms that can often be seen in inappropriate mixing, such as clothes of more than one type of material, and we see that in Leviticus 19. Those who were born with physical deformities are also separated, so they do not make the rest impure. Importantly, the holiness code, the corpus of laws in Leviticus 17 through 26, concentrates on religious and cultic matters. The holiness code takes up issues such as illegitimate sacrifice, the consumption of blood, the proper treatment of the blood of non-sacrificial animals, and the ritual treatment of one who eats an animal carcass. The code also contains a variety of texts that illustrates the call to be holy. Additionally, the Holiness Code contains texts dealing with a variety of concerns related to the priestly office and its conduct. The code also includes details about a festival calendar. Basically, the corpus as a whole is thought to be theologically unified around the notion of holiness, purity, cleanliness, etc., both of Yahweh and consequently of Israel. Improper sexual relations. Proper sexual relations also relate to purity and impurity. For example, a man was unclean if he spilled his seed in any way, and a woman was unclean during her menstrual cycle. And we see this in Leviticus 15. Having sexual relations with a woman who was menstruating also made both parties unclean because it was an inappropriate mixing, among other things. And we see this in Leviticus 18. Semen as a holy seed was for procreation only. As this chart demonstrates, the priestly cosmology illuminates or highlights how the law and the priest saw holiness and difference in terms of space. Here you see the tabernacle and the holies of holies is at the center. Time, you see you have the Sabbath, then festivals, then ordinary time. And people. Yahweh is clearly at the center, but we find priests, Levites, men, women, Israelites, and non-Israelites in concentric circles, all at different distances or degrees away from the Most Holy. In conclusion, in many ways, the documentary hypothesis and the priestly cosmology work together. The documentary hypothesis explains the contradictions in the first 5 books of the Bible, and the priestly cosmology helps readers understand the perspective of the all-important priestly writer. With an understanding of these two concepts, the material in the Torah or Pentateuch should make much more sense, or should take on much more meaning. Thank you.